are here for yet another installment of our Getting to Know online event series, where we chat with members of our fashion studies community from around the world about their career trajectory and their current body of work. And this week we are joined by Joshua Katcher, menswear designer, author, educator, animal rights activist, vegan cheesemonger, as you may have just heard. I'm sure we'll chat about that a little bit too. So thank you for joining us today, Joshua.
Thank you for having me. I am very excited to talk about some of these issues.
Yeah. So I'm hoping, first of all, that you could start off telling us a little bit about the path that brought you to where you are today. What exactly is your training and education?
Yeah, it's a very not direct pathway to fashion. It's interesting. I grew up in upstate New York, and my great-grandparents actually were glove makers. They worked in Gloversville, New York. And I didn't know that until one of my cousins was doing some ancestry research, and I discovered this listed on one of the census documents from early 1900s. Most of my family came over fleeing anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and settled in the New York City area, and some of them ended up glove makers. And so it was interesting to find that out. My parents were both public school teachers. My grandfather was a taxi driver in Brooklyn, and they lived in Starrett City, which were like the projects up there. And he actually was a mail sorter for Andy Warhol. That was his second job after he gambled his taxi medallion away. So my grandfather saw Andy Warhol in passing as he was sorting his mail. But I ended up in fashion, not intentionally, but I'm so happy that I did. I kind of arrived there from the standpoint of activism. I was always very interested in environmental activism, human rights, animal rights, and I found that fashion was just such an incredibly powerful place to understand identity and politics and economics, and it seemed to be the intersection of all of human culture was what we wear and how we want to be seen and how we identify ourselves, and then also looking behind that and seeing how things are made and what does that reveal.
Right. And your career is so multifaceted. You do a lot of different things, but the common thread that runs through all of that, perhaps pun intended there, common thread, but it is this animal rights activism. It's at the core of all of your work. So can you tell us how that came to be part of your practice, or practices, plural?
Yeah, I came into learning about animal rights philosophy and animal rights theories through the environmental movement, and really looking critically at systems of exploitation. There's a real intersectionality of animal exploitation in the fashion industry, mostly looking at it through the lens of Western white colonial concepts of nature and the natural world being this kind of stockpile of resources for exploitation. And that includes non-human animals, or non-human kin, as non-Westerners would prefer to refer to them. So animal rights, I think, is intrinsically tied to larger concepts of oppression, of exploitation, and of understanding how these systems function. In the fashion system, we can look at those systems specifically, but animal rights on the most basic level for me was just about respecting others' desire to live, respecting others' bodily autonomy, and looking at how these scaled systems of exploitation really erase individuality, erase identity, erase anything that would see them as anything other than property and products.
Mhm. And would you tell us a little bit about the platform of Brave Gentleman
Yeah, so
in
Brave
the context of that?
Yes. So Brave Gentleman is a brand that I started in 2010. It's masculine aesthetics. So it's for anybody who enjoys masculine aesthetics. We mostly focus on footwear. I started writing about ethical menswear in 2008. And at the time, most ideas around sustainable fashion and ethical fashion were really geared towards a more femme-inclined audience, people who were more interested in femme aesthetics. And so I wanted to make space for more masculine aesthetics for that conversation to maybe enter a realm like, you know, GQ or Esquire, or start these conversations being had among mainstream, you know, masculine identifying people. So that is where the brand emerged from. And it is the first, I believe, totally vegan, sustainable menswear brand in the world. And we are now going into being in business for a decade, which I just can't believe the time has gone by like that. But yeah, we do footwear, accessories, belts, bags, suiting, and we don't use any animal materials or inputs at all. And as much as possible, we try to use the most sustainable, innovative, high-tech, plant-based organic materials and recycled synthetic materials. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really beautiful. You should head over to his website and check out his work.
Thank you.
You and I met several years ago when you were working on your book, Fashion Animals. See lower left. Would you tell us a little bit more about the book, and were there any key moments in the process of writing, and particularly research, because you did a ton of research? This book was in the works for quite a while. Was there anything that was particularly impactful or poignant for you that you learned in that process?
So much happened during this process that changed my view on things, changed my entire worldview, but also I think probably the most revealing thing was how little there was on this topic, how difficult it was to find the materials. And I came to you, I was just like, help, I need to find these archival and vintage and historical fashion media and fashion images that include animals. And it just wasn't, it's not often labeled in the cataloging that there's the
Right.
presence of animals and images. They're seen as props, they're seen as decoration. And that in itself was something that I was very interested in, how we kind of corral animals into this category, animals, and how we fail to recognize them as valid individuals with an inner life and with a social life and with a will to live. And in fashion, animals are so frequently just seen as a source of inspiration, a pigment to paint with, just a product, a material. And that in and of itself was what I was looking for. So I think the process of realizing how this topic hadn't really been covered in fashion studies to any large extent. As far as I know, this is the only book that really looks at animals in the fashion industry from a critical animal studies standpoint, from an intersectional standpoint, and from a fashion history standpoint. So it's something that I hope can be a springboard from which more research can be done. But you were so helpful in finding a lot of these images, and some of the most powerful images in the book, April. You kind of were like, hey, what about this? There was that one really beautiful hand-painted French fur catalog with the poetry, and it just so clearly shows the separation between what happens to the animal and then the symbol that the animal object becomes, and how distinctly and contrastingly different that is, the process from the product.
Yeah. I mean, that book is so explicit. Like, I think there's is it the mink that's in the little trap?
It was
Is it
the
a
white
mink?
fox. I think that,
The fox is like on one page in pochoir, in the little trap, and then on the opposite page is the woman wearing the pelt.
yes.
And in French, what is the phrase? It's like the sentiment is something to the effect of, he has served his purpose to die,
Yeah.
or
It basically says,
or something to that effect.
here it is.
He has reached his highest purpose.
So this is this Parchoir catalog, and on the I guess right now it's on my right, is this white fox that's trapped and bleeding, and then on the left is this, the model illustrated wearing the fur, and this French poem basically says that the fox has no value until it becomes useful to humans, that the fox will know triumph once it becomes a coat, that and that sentiment, I think, is really pervasive, especially in early 20th century and late 19th century fashion concepts around animal materials, that animals they're suicidal in their desire to become fashion objects, to become these powerful symbols that are useful to and celebrated by humans. That humans are on this, on the hierarchical ladder of importance. Humans are way up at the top, especially, white European humans. And then animals want to, the way to get up to the top of that ladder is to be killed or to die and be turned into an object that makes you complementary to the human ego.
Yeah, and I think it was really surprising to both of us, like once we started pulling things out, like how pervasive that sentiment was in the imagery
Everywhere.
pertaining to animals. It was just like again and again and again and again and again.
It was like we had.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just saying, it was like we uncovered this trope that hadn't really been noticed before, and then all of a sudden, once we were aware of the trope, it was like, oh yeah, this is everywhere. And once you start looking at fashion media through that lens, even contemporary fashion media, advertisements, editorials, you name it, if you start looking at how animals are used, whether it's as materials or whether it's as decoration or props, whether it's as agents of human interest, it becomes very revealing, and it unveils a lot of systems of exploitation and oppression that affect, that are intersectional.
Yeah, and I think some of the most interesting examples are some of the like more contemporary fashion photography that you cite in the book, that I think in certain ways we're so just used to seeing animals in fashion photographs that once you kind of like look at it more critically, and you've seen that happening in the 19th century, and then you see it still happening in the 21st century. There's the one example in the book that you gave about the woman, I think it's an image from the 90s, or maybe it's even the late 80s, of the woman in the white fur coat, and she's surrounded by all the kittens.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That's actually from the 2000s. That's one of the first images in the book. This one by Greg Cadell. It's Constance Jablonski with the kittens. This one? Yeah.
Yes.
So that image was really what sparked the starting of the book. I saw that image, and what was so interesting to me about it was that the kittens were being seemingly celebrated. There was this nurturement, this cuteness. The philosophy of cuteness is a very interesting topic, in and of itself, and there's a whole book about that, which I highly recommend. But the idea of cuteness and of caretaking and nurturement contrasted against the model wearing a fur coat. So we have these 5 or 6 kittens that are validated and that are adored, and then we have probably about 10 to 20 other animals who have completely disappeared into an object, who have the definition of objectification in the most literal sense, becoming an object, becoming a fashion object. And those animals' interests are completely erased, and the story of who they are and where they came from is erased. And the kittens are given this validity, even though, you know, you peel back one layer and it's like, okay, well, where did these kittens actually come from as props for this photo shoot, and how were they treated, and where did they end up afterwards? Were they rescued? Were they bred? You know, there's all these surrounding issues, but the
Right.
fantasy of the image tells such a story that we love to subscribe to. And that story about us is that we love animals. We're animal lovers. People love animals. And that is such an ego-flattering self-assigned concept, but it does stand in direct contradiction to the actual function of the fashion system.
So you and I were chatting the other day, and you made this really powerful observation that we are in this middle of this pandemic right now, largely because of some of these attitudes of humans' treatment of non-human animals. And if you tug on that a little bit further, it just unleashes this flood of this intersectionality that you have been touching on. So how is the pandemic related to these philosophies, and how does this relate to the fashion industry?
In myriad ways. The most obvious way is that like you know, avian flu, like swine flu, like Ebola, like and now, you know, COVID-19, these are zoonotic diseases. These are diseases that emerge as a result of how we treat and how we interact with the non-human world. Our intensive confinement, our industrialization of animal exploitation, factory farming, wet markets, these are the places where zoonotic diseases will make a jump from the non-human world into human society, and then have these massive laboratories to grow and to spread. And I think that most of the research that's looking at the origins of something like COVID-19, as with most other zoonotic diseases, it is a result of conditions, the way that we confine and exploit non-human animals. And where this intersects with fashion is that many fashion systems rely on those systems of exploitation for their most treasured products, whether it's leather, whether it's fur, whether it's wool. These are intensive animal operations that are so different from what is marketed about those products. The mink industry is the perfect example of how COVID and fashion are interacting. The Netherlands and now Spain have had to gas, I think, over 1 million mink. COVID basically wiped out the mink industry several weeks ago. They had to shut down all the fur farms because COVID was spreading between mink on fur farms and between those fur farmed mink and the workers. So it was jumping back and forth between mink and people, and it was spreading among the workers, and it was spreading among the mink. And those conditions likely would not have happened had it not been for intensive animal confinement. Fur farming is factory farming. And so when we see things like that, it unveils this larger way that we operate, this larger system of animal exploitation and the dangers that it poses, not only to us, but also to the non-human world. And so as we look at the way that fashion values animal materials, I wrote that article for the Business of Fashion about the illegal market for animal products in the United States, with the top importer of illegally traded animal parts being the fashion industry. There was a criminal study out of John Jay College looking at the illegal importing and the black market in animal materials, and the fashion industry is responsible for the majority of that, with many major brands being named. And so you have this legal system of farms and factory farms, and you have this illegal system of trafficking wildlife and trafficking illegal animal parts. And then you have all of the biology and the risk that goes into moving all those things around in human society. So it's a very troubling outlook, not to mention the habitat loss.
Right.
Biodiversity is a safeguard against things like pandemics. And the top threat to biodiversity, according to the Center for Biological Diversity, is grazing, livestock grazing, the destruction and transformation of huge swaths of wild spaces for sheep grazing, for cattle grazing. And you look at something like the wool industry, 1 billion sheep on the planet. That requires huge amounts of land that have to be, transformed to protect the sheep. You have to get rid of predators. You have to kind of, when we look at something like bovine cattle, cows in South America, they have to destroy the rainforests. That's the top driver of rainforest destruction for cattle grazing. And that's the $80 billion footwear industry, and the $414 billion leather industry is directly tied to how much we adore leather and fashion. And that habitat destruction is the loss of biodiversity, is a loss of a safeguard against zoonotic diseases.
Yeah. I would categorize you as a fashion futurist. Correct me if you do not see yourself that way.
Thank you.
Where do you think the trajectory of your work is headed moving forward?
I'm so excited about the innovations that are happening. I'm kept very optimistic. The research that I did for my book and the topics that I typically lecture on tend to be very dark. There's a lot of violence, a lot of suffering, and a lot of destruction. But on the flip side of that, there is so much visionary innovation happening. And I'm really excited about what's happening in the realm of biofabrication. Mm-hmm. I have with me actually right here this tie from Bolt Threads that is made from biosynthetic spider silk. So this is spider silk that was actually grown in a laboratory. So it's biologically identical to silk, but there were no animals involved in the production process. They figured out how to synthesize the proteins. So this is a direct this is a direct symbol that we can synthesize proteins. We can grow leather in the laboratory. There are already companies like Modern Meadow who do that. And in addition to growing animal proteins in the lab, we, keratin for wool, for alpaca, for fur. There's a company, Furoid, in Europe that's doing lab-grown fur, lab-grown hair follicles that can grow fur. I mean, imagine a future where you have a fur wall that's a wall of lab-grown skin that just grows fur, and you can cut whatever shape you want out of it. It can be biologically customized for color, for fragrance, for thickness, for length. From a design standpoint, the future of biofabrication, I think, is so exciting. And from a sustainability and ethics standpoint, removing individuals who don't want to die from these processes, individuals who fight to live and who end up being confined and suffering. If we can eliminate that, why wouldn't we? It checks off so many boxes of what we could hope for a sustainable and ethical fashion future. I think that I would hope that Brave Gentleman, my brand, would be able to tap into and use some of these emerging technologies as they become more and more available.
Yeah, I discovered a company in Mexico. Do you know this company called Deserto?
Yeah, they're doing the cactus-based leather.
Yeah, it's very cool. And I was like reading about, they go into detail about the entire process of kind of how it's done, but their Nepal farms are, they don't even use additional water. It's all just rainwater. In terms of drying out the leather, they're not using any fuels. They're just letting them dry in the sun. And it was just like this really fascinating snapshot of like how you really can do this like as sustainably as possible. Like it's all there. And of course they have their proprietary process of how the you know, raw cactus materials get converted into the leather product. But even the scraps from their process end up as entering the foodstuffs industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know, I thought their kind of system was quite interesting.
Definitely. And there's a few companies like that. There's another company in the United States called Natural Fiber Welding. And they're doing a 100% organic matter, which is mostly agricultural waste based leather that is totally biodegradable. There's no polyurethane in it. There's no synthetics. There's no backing, like there's no canvas or woven polyester backing. And I've touched that material, and it's supple, it's beautiful, and durable. And also there's companies using mycelium mushrooms to grow these mushroom-based leathers. So there is so much exciting, whether it's cactus, whether it's pineapple, whether it's agricultural waste. The exciting thing about innovation is that it's always getting better and better. It's always getting more advanced. There's more ideas. We are problem solvers. But when it comes to animal materials, there's only so many ways that you can genetically modify and confine and, you know, and kill animals. It's a pretty I would just say old-fashioned process that is stuck. It's not really evolving, and it's not getting better. It's just it's trying to maintain a status quo. And I think it's time that we really focus on changing our ideas about what are luxury materials. What does that really mean anymore? Why do we think something like cashmere and leather and fur, why do these define luxury in the first place? Is it tied to our ideas of royalty and power? Is it tied to, you know, European ideas of power? And if we look at those things, I think there's a misalignment of the aspiration and the symbols we're hoping to communicate about empowerment, and then the actual reality of how these things are made, and oppression and disempowerment. Especially, you know, there's a whole part of this conversation about, I think, indigenous practices, and there's a lot to be said at the intersection of vegan fashion, sustainability, animal rights, and traditional indigenous materiality and fashion practices. That's probably a topic for another day if we don't have time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I went to the Slow Factory conference that was a few months back, and that was really kind of like sitting at the core of all of the discussions that day as how human rights and animal rights and environmental you know, issues are all tied into each other. You cannot separate those three things.
It's true. And I think that there is a mainstream stereotype about veganism and animal rights, that it's a white European idea and interest. And I work with a lot of Black and Indigenous animal activists who, you know, this is something that they're constantly trying to correct. I work with an organization called Vegan Voices of Color, and two of the founders, Unique Vance, who's a slow fashion advocate, and she works at the Center for Biological Diversity, and Erin Luxor, who is a fashion designer in Los Angeles. They said, they said that we can work towards eco-conscious designs that omit the furs and skins of our beautiful fellow earthlings. They're intricately tied to our struggle for social justice and total liberation. So I think that there's an interesting thing that happened with Canada Goose recently, where they announced that they were going to start using recycled fur in their hoods as opposed to using new coyote fur. And I wrote an article about how this was humane washing, which is very similar to greenwashing, whitewashing, humane washing. And I asked Margaret Robinson, who is a Canadian Mi'kmaq feminist vegan scholar, and she's an assistant professor of Indigenous studies at Dalhousie in Halifax. And she said, the Canada Goose website plays up a love for the North, but it's the same colonial model we've seen from settler companies again and again: entitlement, charity, exploitation. The Canada Goose brand is about supporting settler entitlement to travel. Cutting a check to Inuit designers doesn't change the colonial dynamic. So Canada Goose was using Inuit designers to kind of whitewash their brand, to make it look like they were being environmentally responsible, and so she had a lot to say about that, and I really admire her work and recommend anybody check out Margaret Robinson's her research. Also the work of Vegan Voices of Color, and yeah.
Oh, awesome. We're about out of time, but do you have any parting thoughts that you want to share with anyone who's here joining us today?
Yeah, I think that I came up with a term that I really want to enter the fashion academic space. It's Circumfauna, and I'll type it in the box. So I came up with this term as a way to centralize and contextualize research and data regarding the use of animals in fashion, from environmental impacts and ethical implications to emerging technologies and historical information. And so this would be, I would categorize all this research under that term, circumfauna. So you could refer to materials as circumfaunal materials. Mm-hmm. You can look at fashion and fashion history and fashion studies through the lens of circumfauna, which is really about finding a way around animal inputs and discussing the contexts of animal inputs in fashion. So please use that term.
Yeah, and if people would like to get in touch with you, if they have questions or just kind of want to know more about your work, where can they find you?
Definitely. You can find me. My personal Instagram is The Discerning Brute. I typed it out right there. My brand is Brave Gentleman. And then my book, which you can find in most places that sell books, is Fashion Animals. I love doing guest lectures with classes, so whoever is, if you're a professor or an instructor or a lecturer, I love talking to students, and please reach out to me directly. And I'd love to do a presentation. And definitely one way to support me is to get the book, or to just help promote my research. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us today, as well as all of you who tuned in. So I think we will sign off for now, but also if you're interested in Joshua's vegan cheese, I can attest to the fact that it is very delicious.
Oh yeah, that is, here, I'll put that one there too.
This company is called Rind.
Rind.cheese. We're just growing now. I have too many businesses going on. And I feel
like every time I talk to you, you're like, oh, here's my new business that I'm doing. You're just like me, though. That's why we're friends. How many jobs can we have?
I know, you're like managing an herb garden on your roof. I got some really delicious basil and thyme from your rooftop herb garden. So yeah. Thank you for that.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks everybody.